I'm Canadian astronaut Jenni Sidey-Gibbons, and I'm ready to start digging deep.
I'm Mark Sutcliffe. Welcome to Digging Deep, presented by Zen Books. Digging Deep is a series of one-on-one conversations with thoughtful, accomplished people who have powerful lessons to share, valuable observations, and unique perspectives from which we could all benefit. They come from many different fields: business, music, media, entertainment, even space exploration in this case. Here's how we do it. We start off with some rapid-fire questions with the goal of uncovering little pieces of information about the guest, things you might not have known, some fun things, some serious things as well. And then we start digging deep into the background behind those stories and the life lessons that arise from them. Our guest today is an astronaut, Jenni Sidey-Gibbons. In 2017, Jenni was chosen from among an enormous field of candidates to be one of Canada's next astronauts. She has since completed a 2-year astronaut training program at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. Imagine what that experience would have been like. Now, before she joined the space program, Jenni was an assistant professor in internal combustion engines at the Department of Engineering at the University of Cambridge. She is a passionate advocate for women and girls entering the STEM fields, that's science, technology, engineering, and math. In fact, she co-founded the Cambridge chapter of Robo Gals, which is a student-run international organization that aims to inspire and empower young women to study STEM, and they do it through fun and educational initiatives. In our conversation, we talk about the many lessons Jenni has learned from her extensive and exhaustive preparation to become an astronaut, including risk management, why you never train for a good day in space. We talk about how to pick role models. We talk about how not every problem can actually be solved and what you can do about that. And more importantly, we talk about how she learned why it's important to back yourself. I think this is the most significant lesson that I took away from this discussion. I think you'll find that really interesting. Now, one last thing before we get started. If you like what you hear, then please post a review on iTunes or elsewhere and share this podcast with people you know and subscribe to it if you haven't already. And if you're looking for more information about the show, if you want to read my daily blog where I post short observations and lessons every single day of the year, or if you want to subscribe to my newsletter, The Weekly Dig, which has 5 very quick items that I've learned about each week, please go to our website, letsdigdeep.com. Letsdigdeep.com. You can also find a link there to my TEDx talk. Now, let's start digging deep with Jenni Sidey-Gibbons. Jenni, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited about our conversation. I've read so much about you, and we've spoken a few times before, but never like this. And I think you're a terrific role model for kids, especially girls, because of your background in science and your interest in space exploration and things like math and rugby and other things like that. So thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for setting this up and getting ready to have a chat with me. I'm excited to speak with you again.
Let's start with some quick questions to kind of learn a little bit more about you, and then we'll start digging deep. But first of all, who was your hero when you were 10 years old?
My hero when I was 10 years old. So I had a pretty good hero role model early on with Roberta Bondar, but I think that was when I was younger than 10. So when I was 10 years old, I'd kind of moved on to really liking being outside, exploring. I had an idea of what engineering was, and I would say my hero was my uncle, my mom's brother, who was, he still is, working as a fantastic engineer out of Ucluelet and Tofino on Vancouver Island.
Okay. And what's your fondest childhood memory?
I have some wonderful memories of going to the Calgary Zoo. I just loved kind of discovering new things. The Royal Ontario Museum when we went to visit Toronto. Museums and kind of those science visits are my best memories.
What did you think you were going to be when you grew up?
I went through a few different phases. I thought I would be an astronaut when I was really little. I thought I would be a geologist for a long time. After that, I went through a pretty strong phase of wanting to be a doctor. So it depends what age. By the time I graduated high school, I was thinking biomedical engineer, maybe aeronautical.
What is your greatest mistake and what did you learn from it?
Greatest mistake. My greatest mistake was probably doubting myself for no reason. And I've done that a couple times in my career, and it's really hard not to do. I think everyone does it to some extent. And my big lesson from that was just back yourself. If someone's going to tell you no, let them do it. Don't do it yourself.
Great lesson. For what do you feel most grateful?
My family.
What has been the best year of your life so far and why?
So I had a great year, 2016 into 2017. I met my husband. I got a job as a brand new equivalent of an assistant professor at Cambridge, and I was in the astronaut recruitment campaign. So it'd be a tough go to pick between 2016 2017, so maybe I won't pick a calendar year.
Okay, that's fine. What was the toughest year of your life?
That year as well. Yeah, by far the most challenging. I was juggling a lot. The recruitment process was pretty intense.
What one person would you say has had the greatest impact on your life?
Long-term impact, definitely my mother. I just have a wonderful, wonderful mother. I'm so grateful for that. Short-term impact, my husband has had a huge impact on the way I approach different problems in my career, and very positive, all of them. So probably long-term, my mom, short-term, my husband.
What is the most important lesson that you've learned that you'd want to share with others?
I have to come back to that really important lesson, just back yourself. There'll be little failures along the way, but you shouldn't be the one saying no to yourself. Trust yourself a little bit.
What would you say is the biggest factor that led to where you are today?
I'd like to say it's something like grit or passion, which I think are really important, but being honest, it's probably a lot of luck as well.
Why do you say that?
I think I met so many people along my journey who are passionate and resilient and have done so many amazing things. And I just see so much potential and success in them. And I think especially in the recruitment process, a lot of us could have done this job. So I wasn't really in the mind of the people who were selecting us. I tried to stay out of that arena and just do what I could. But yeah, I think any of them could be here.
What would people be most surprised to learn about you?
Probably how I spend my spare time.
I didn't think you had any spare time.
I do have a bit. I think there probably are some misconceptions about what an astronaut does as well. We spend a lot of time supporting missions that we're actually not directly a part of, not flying in space for. I think my day-to-day might surprise some people.
Okay, we'll explore that a little bit. What is your secret talent? You have many talents. What would be one that's kind of a secret?
So I guess if it's secret, it doesn't come up very often. I think that I am very talented at some what you would consider childhood art projects. So my ability as an artist probably never matured, but if you need something like papier-mâché, probably I could help you out.
Okay, cool. What is the most fun you've ever had?
I had a lot of fun during my PhD with my rugby team. We had a really great season around the time that I finished my PhD, so coming into 2015, and I think that was the most fun I've ever had.
What's the scariest thing you've ever done?
I've done a lot of things that I think would traditionally or conventionally be considered scary since joining the astronaut corps, and even since the recruitment campaign. So I'll kind of loop that in. I think those would be textbook the scariest things I've ever done.
Is there any one in particular? Because you've done, I mean, as part of the training, you're doing things like getting out of a helicopter in the water and flying a supersonic jet. So, I mean, you've done a lot of things that are scarier than most people would do. Is there one that stands out?
It's kind of funny. So those things are definitely scary, but the more you learn about them, the less scary they become. So the more you learn about the process and how to succeed in that environment, and you're uh, you're given the training that you need to succeed. Maybe not so much with the helicopter egress, because we were kind of thrown into that one to see how we would react, but certainly with the jet, those things get a lot less scary. And I think it sort of depends what your fear factor is. There was one event in the recruitment process where we were confined to a very small space. So if claustrophobia is an issue, that certainly would have ticked the box for a lot of people, and I thought that would be really intimidating. But again, once you're in it, you just do it. So it's hard to say. A lot of the helicopter egress was scary. That claustrophobia test was initially pretty intimidating, but again, that fear kind of subsides once you prepare a little bit and you're in the situation.
Can't be an astronaut if you have claustrophobia, though, right? I mean, you're
I think you have to get used to it. Yeah, you have to be okay in small spaces.
Yeah. What is your boldest prediction for the future?
That humankind will continue to advance and explore in space, and we will see enormous benefits from it.
What would be the message of your commencement address if you were speaking to a group of graduating students?
When I speak to students, I really like to talk about backing yourself. Again, that's going to be a common theme if we talk about that message that I want to share. And I just think it's so important. I see so many people discounting themselves unnecessarily early on. There's plenty of people who might say no, but again, it shouldn't be you.
What has been the greatest turning point in your life so far?
The biggest kind of strange kink in my career was certainly joining the astronaut corps. That was a really unexpected joy and opportunity. So yeah, that's a huge turning point, I think.
What has been a recent epiphany for you? Is there anything that you've learned recently that has surprised you or changed your way of thinking?
I think I've learned a lot about the difference between solving problems and coming up with solutions to improve them. So I used to think of myself a lot as a problem solver, and I think that's what an engineer does to an extent. They love solving problems, but sometimes you have to push through with a solution to make it better and improve the situation. Some problems are just too big to solve.
Wow, that's really interesting. We'll come back to that. What book are you most likely to recommend to others?
So I really love recommending these Italo Calvino's books. I think those are really, really cool. I've talked about those books a little bit before. On Winter's Night, a Traveler is a really wonderful one, and Cosmocomics is really cool. One of the characters in the short stories in Cosmocomics is, I think, one of the laws of thermodynamics, which I thought, when I read that, I'd never read anything like that. So I always recommend that to people, but I've been recommending that for a while. So if I had to come up with the new one, maybe a sci-fi book like The Expanse was pretty cool. Yeah, something like that.
Okay, those are good suggestions. Jenni, thank you for answering these questions. In just a moment, we're going to start digging deep with astronaut Jenni Sidey-Gibbons. We're just going to take a quick break so I can tell you a little bit more about the presenting sponsor of Digging Deep, ZenBooks. ZenBooks is Canada's go-to cloud accounting firm. They are not your typical accounting firm. I know the founders, Colin and Eric. I've worked with them for several years. And here's why I think you should consider working with them too. First of all, they bring a fresh, unique, modern approach to what is a very old-fashioned industry. These guys were working remotely and in the cloud long before it became cool. ZenBooks also uses technology to your advantage. I think this is really important. They give you the tools and analysis you need to monitor your business in real time. That's so valuable right now when everything changes so quickly. Yes, they're a virtual accounting firm, but that doesn't mean they're offshore, and it doesn't mean they're inattentive. ZenBooks combines the efficiency and effectiveness of a cloud accounting service with all the benefits that you'd want from a trusted advisor, high-level advice, and strategic support. Now, here's what I think is going to happen if you work with ZenBooks. You'll probably start out taking advantage of their cutting-edge cloud accounting solutions, but in the long run, I think you'll stay with them because of their strategic guidance and problem solving. Among their core values, they specifically list being candid and proactive. Isn't that exactly what you want from a trusted advisor? Look, even if you're already working with an accountant or a bookkeeper, or you have some accounting staff on your team, I think you should still talk to ZenBooks and learn more about their tools and their expertise. Check out ZenBooks at zenbooks.ca. That's zenbooks.ca. We are digging deep with astronaut Jenni Sidey-Gibbons, and you talked a few minutes ago about the role your mom has played in your life. Tell me a bit about how she sparked and supported your interest in science and math.
Of course. Well, again, I feel so fortunate with the family that I have, and I had a lot of support from different aspects and different members of my family, but I always talk about my mom because she just stands out as someone who, she didn't have a background in science or engineering. She was actually a dancer and a dance teacher later in life. So I was sitting in on a lot of baby ballet classes and tap classes when I was little as well. So she wasn't a part of that world at all, but I think she did an exceptional job at immersing me in it regardless, because it was what I was interested in. And now that I'm a bit older, I think I appreciate how challenging that must have been initially. It's something you don't really take to, or she's very, very clever, but she was in a different career entirely. So she immersed me in it entirely. I can't even think about how many hours we spent at science centers or just these public sort of educational opportunities that people are provided with, but do take a lot of effort to take advantage of. So I was also interested in crafts a lot and being creative when I was a kid. And I remember we would go to science centers where they were doing these sort of interactive exhibits that had creativity involved. And I remember really enjoying those, and going to museums and science centers, and she'd set up things at home for me and make sure I had good influences, including her brother, who's an engineer, and my father also being an engineer. I just think she was really aware of that. And that's hard. Again, there's no rule book for kids. So I think that's really impressive.
There are lots of discussions going on about how to encourage girls to stay in STEM, in science, technology, engineering, and math. What was going on there with your mom? Was that a conscious effort on her part? Was it just that you were interested in it and she would support anything? Or was there almost an extra kind of level of support because she wanted you to have the opportunity to be successful if you wanted to in a non-traditional area?
Yeah, it's hard to say. If there was, I certainly wasn't aware of it at that time because, again, I was pretty young. So I wouldn't be surprised to hear that was going on and she was aware of that issue. I do think it's very important to find these influences and be encouraging, even with groups that aren't kind of conventionally dominant in engineering workforce. It is a very male-dominated profession, although it is getting a lot better and a lot more diverse. And you do hear a lot about engineers taking to something right away, or like they were always mechanically minded, but that's such a narrow vision of what engineering is. And for some engineers, certainly it is like that. And I've spoken to parents who are like, I always knew that they were interested in engineering because of the way that they liked to play with different trinkets or put things together, or I don't know, even interests in moving parts or something. But there are so many other paths toward engineering because it is such a broad profession. So whether she recognized that maybe that was engineering from the beginning, or it was just being artistic and liking science and putting those two things together, you kind of get close to engineering because it's solving problems creatively. I don't really know, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was in the back of her mind. I just didn't see it, maybe.
Yeah, and you were a sample size of one in your own world, right? So you don't have anything to compare it to. So it's hard to know, I guess. But what do you feel about some of that now? And what do you think we can do to stimulate and support more girls to pursue careers in STEM?
I think one thing that we're doing a better job of now is making spreading the word about what the profession is. So again, some people, again, when they think of engineering, don't necessarily think of creativity. And that doesn't work for everybody. Not everyone will take to engineering more if they learn that it's a creative profession, but it certainly worked for me. I think we're spreading that message that it's a diverse profession. You can be interested in medicine, helping people, creating different environments for people to thrive in. You can be interested in more conventional engineering disciplines that people often think of, mechanical engineering, let's say. All of those are the same initial route once you get to university, that you choose an engineering degree. So I think we're doing a really good job of spreading that message that there are so many options once you do become an engineer. We're also doing a good job of, I think, providing role models. That's something I benefited from as well. I know Roberta Bondar is not an engineer, but she is obviously an outstanding Canadian role model. She's Canada's first female astronaut, and I benefited from seeing her mission early on, and my mom definitely emphasized that for me, which again I'm sure was intentional. So that's important as well. Providing these role models, it is important to see people who you identify with, or you take to, or even are similar to in these kinds of roles, because it just adds a lot of possibility and it gets you thinking about it, and might not be the most important thing, but it's certainly important. So I like to see that as well. I'd say those are my two biggest things I'm proud to see people doing, especially people in Canada, but also things that I like to see people emphasize is role models. Maybe mentorship is important. Those are also very different things, and spreading the word.
You co-founded something called Robo Gals, or a chapter of Robo Gals while you were at Cambridge. Tell me about that and why you wanted to be part of that.
Absolutely. So Robo Gals actually was originally founded, I believe, in Australia, and it just was one of these initiatives that I thought was really positive. It involved everyone in robotics. Maybe the name is a bit of a misnomer, because everyone was invited to join these sessions. It just had an emphasis on getting both boys and girls interested in it, and making sure that a lot of women led these robotics sessions. It was this outreach program. And I think that was really positive, kind of both on the message of creativity and something like robotics, which is, I think, conventionally considered to be a very strictly engineering science, or I think a lot of the creativity is missed when it's talked about in a conventional way, and also providing role models for people to see women leading these sessions. So Robo Gals was just kind of the right place at the right time. There wasn't a chapter in Cambridge at the moment, and I knew I wanted to be involved in getting kids learning a little bit outside of my PhD, and it was just a great opportunity to do that. I know there are a couple of chapters of Robo Gals in Canada as well, but there also are so many other outstanding outreach opportunities. As long as you just get people thinking and learning and talking, it's a good thing.
Now, while you were at Cambridge, you were working as an assistant professor in internal combustion engines. Is that right? And
yep, that's right.
You were teaching classes on things like thermodynamics and flame physics. So how did that happen? How did you end up in that space in particular? What was it that led you there?
I benefited from a very positive series of mentors, and kind of stumbling upon a field that I thought was just so interesting at the right time. So by the time that I settled on engineering and I decided that it was what I wanted to do, I didn't exactly know what type of engineering, but I knew that it was broad enough that it held a lot of opportunity for me. So I started in my mechanical engineering course at McGill, and I think around my second year, I had a class with a professor there. He's still there. His name is Jeff Berg-Thorson. So Prof. Berg-Thorson was my teacher for thermodynamics 1. And he studies combustion, and he spoke about thermodynamics in such an interesting way, and it was just something that I took to. I really enjoyed the class. I did well in it. I felt like it was intuitive for me, and I wanted to be involved with research. So I started talking to him about combustion activities that were going on at McGill, and that led me down this interesting path of studying flame physics, and that can mean a lot of different things, but I just was so fascinated with this idea that we've been using fire for so long as a tool, but also just, it really is so important to humans if you think about what fire has done. It's a catalyst for our development. I mean, it's really important, if we look at human anthropology and development and evolution, but also in social structure and social development, and it allowed for a nomadic lifestyle, all of these wonderful branches of using fire since our definition as a species, and we still didn't really understand the chemical reactions that were going on or how it goes out, how it starts. I thought those physics were really interesting. So I think that's initially what kind of captured my imagination about fire. And then the next mentor I encountered who was outstanding is my PhD supervisor at Cambridge. Once I got there, he was the one who asked me really early on, what do you want from this PhD? Where do you want to be? What do you want to study? At the time, maybe you have no idea, but someone who asks you those questions that early on is a good person to learn from, because they're really switched on about where you want to end up. And I just, with that mentorship, I took to it really well, and I really enjoyed my PhD and decided academia was something I wanted to keep doing. I wanted to keep discovering and learning and teaching, and right place at the right time, a position opened up at Cambridge, so I stayed.
And just before we leave that, you would think that, I mean, obviously there's combustion involved in launching a spaceship, no question about that. But there's not necessarily huge overlap there with what you're about to do as an astronaut. But I read something about how fire burns differently in space. So can you quickly tell us about that?
Yeah, of course. So you're right, there is a bit of overlap. I love talking to engineers who work on engine development, or even some of the scientists there are combustion experiments on the space station, like you say. So there are little glimpses of my previous wheelhouse in this job, but for the most part, it's completely different. I'm a user and an operator. So I think the big things that I transferred over are that problem-solving ability and ability to learn quickly. But fire does burn differently in space. So it's actually true that a lot of phenomena that we would recognize here on our Earth's surface are different in space, because you are not seeing the effects of something that controls a lot of what we see, which is a 1G environment, gravity, one gravity, if you like. So on Earth, we know that hot things rise. There's a density change, and that's what is a controlling feature, or say a dominant feature in the shape of fire. It's why a candle is teardrop shaped, because the gases as they heat rise, and that causes this kind of cone shape that we associate with a candle. But in space, we don't really have that density gradient. Well, we do, but we don't have buoyancy. Hot things don't rise because they're not lighter, because we're not dealing with a 1G environment. So we see a different controlling phenomenon, and that is actually diffusion. We don't have to get into the details, but as the fuel diffuses outward from the candle, those hot gases are no longer going to rise. So instead of getting a teardrop shape, you get a spherical shape, which is really interesting. It looks very, very different. So I would encourage everyone to kind of check it out. And that's sort of the tip of the iceberg. As usual with fire, there's so many other things going on in the combustion process. So there's a lot of interesting physics that you can see once you stop looking at the effect of gravity.
Yeah, fascinating. So what was it that prompted you to apply for the space program and compete to be an astronaut?
So I had some early involvement in the activities of the Canadian Space Agency when I was an undergraduate. I did some combustion experiments on a microgravity flight, actually in Ottawa, the National Research Council. I enjoyed that, but being an astronaut wasn't really on my mind. I just thought it was another really cool environment to observe a combustion experiment. I was happy to be involved. And then when I was in my postdoc, actually one of my teaching assistants, or a supervisor, I guess, from my undergraduate degree at McGill visited Tyler, and I think he taught me supervisions for advanced dynamics of systems, or some mechanics course that I found very challenging, but he was a great teacher, so really, really helpful. He came to visit me, and he was talking about, we were talking about the space agency, and he said, they're going to recruit soon, you should apply. And it wasn't on my radar at all, but when they did announce that they were recruiting, the process before was nearly 10 years prior, so it wasn't on my radar then either. And Tyler and I both applied, and we kind of talked a little bit throughout, and yeah, it just seemed like a really wonderful thing to be a part of. I wasn't gunning to be an astronaut. It was on my radar when I was really little, but again, I thought I found my forever job being an academic. I was very happy, and I just felt very thankful as a Canadian that we had such an interesting space program, and what a cool opportunity. You get to go and train like an astronaut and meet all of these other phenomenal Canadians who were doing different things I never would have met in any other environment. So it's just such an interesting and unique chance to participate in a space program that we're very lucky to have in Canada. That was what was going through my mind initially.
Can you describe the year-long application process? Because they basically started with a pretty big number of people and got it down to 2, and they put you through all kinds of different tests and challenges, and you had to do this while you were still working and you were flying back from the UK, right?
Yeah, that's right. It was a very interesting process. It is very intense, but I was fortunate that the bulk of my teaching was in the autumn term of 2016. So it was my first year again in that position, and I had a couple of courses. It was almost entirely in the autumn term. It was a very light load in the following term, leading into winter and spring. So fortunately, at that time, that was the start of the recruitment process. I think the deadline for application was sometime in July or August, I believe. And initially, there was an online test that you had to take, an aptitude test of an initial screening. There was an initial medical exam, and for people in Canada, that consisted of going to, I think, one of the locations that the Canadian Space Agency had picked out to do these examinations. But for me, since I was in the UK and everyone else who was in Europe, we, for the most part, went to Germany. It was near Dusseldorf. There was, I think, a NATO base in Geilenkirchen. I'm not sure I'm saying that right, but that's where I went for my medical examination. That was initial blood work and eye tests, hearing tests, things like that. And then I believe the first actual in-person event, they'd cut it down to around 72 candidates, if I'm not mistaken, and that was in the new year. And that was really tough. That recruitment or assessment center, they called them. The first assessment center was fitness tests, but it was much, much more than that. We were staying at a military base, and it was stressful. They wanted to stress you out and see how you reacted under pressure. And my husband, we were married at the time, but he told me that I should go into that thinking it's the hardest thing I will or have done. And I definitely acknowledged that and thought, yeah, I think this will be challenging. But I don't think I was completely prepared from the label of fitness testing, what that translated to for the Canadian Space Agency. It was fitness testing, but it was sleep deprivation, it was problem solving, it was really pushing you to your limit. They gave you problems without solutions that you had to work towards an answer with people. you were so physically tired, physically drained, probably emotionally quite drained as well. And it was just intense. And I remember thinking like, oh, this was fun, but I'm not sure that I'm going to continue in the process. I hope so, because it was fun as well, but it was very challenging. But then I got asked back. So that was kind of the first time in the recruitment process where I was like, wow, that attitude was not the most helpful to have. I even though I was feeling positive about the process, I certainly did discount myself, and I shouldn't have, because whatever they saw was good enough to be asked back. So at the next assessment center, I thought I'm just going to go for it and do my best. And they're obviously the judges. I'm not. So I should just do my best and see how it goes. And that was also stress testing, but more in a extreme environment, kind of survival testing. So that was like the helicopter egress. There was firefighting. That was the kind of claustrophobia test. A lot of stuff in the water. Yeah, a lot of very stressful sort of situations, but I actually felt like I handled it better than the first one, because I just thought, okay, I'm just going to do my best and expecting it to be very challenging, see where it gets me. The next assessment center was psychological testing, and we also did quite a bit of outreach and communications work. And then I believe there was a final medical, very in-depth medical. They know everything about you by then. So if there's anything to find out, they'll find it. And then a final interview. And I think that was spring 2017. Then we were notified a while later, announced in July, and pretty quick turnaround, moved to Houston to start the NASA astronaut candidate course by the middle of August.
And every step of the way, as you talked about going through different phases of this, they were narrowing the field, right? They were only inviting back a smaller number of people each time.
Yes, that's right. So again, the initial 72 was the first assessment center, and then kind of stepped down from there.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit more about some of the curveballs they threw you. How did they create the sleep deprivation, and what did you learn from operating in those kinds of conditions?
So some of the curveballs were that the way that they ran the actual assessment center, you had these assessors around you who wouldn't give very much away. They had a pretty good deadpan poker face. So interactions with them wasn't, even from the beginning, it was very, very minimal. You were given a set of instructions, but asking questions, you usually were just, the response would be, read your instructions. What do your instructions say? And you weren't given all the information. So it again was seen how you were reacting under stress. There was a lot of psychological assessment. They had psychologists embedded in the process who were following us around when we did individual or team tasks. I think your attitude was probably very important. But there were a lot of tasks where you just were not going to complete them, and you were maybe not going to succeed in the sense that we all think about succeeding, completing a task successfully. You weren't going to do it. You were just going to have to do your best, and they observed what it was going to be like. So stressful in that sense. And then sleep deprivation, they just didn't give you a lot of off time. You had all these materials that they had given you to really study when you were finished. Again, you were in this military base, just thrown in this. For me, people in the armed forces are probably more used to those situations, but for me, it was new.
One of the things that I find interesting about what you just described is that they gave you problems for which there weren't solutions, which means that neither you nor they would end up being distracted by who got to the solution first, right? Because it wasn't really about that. It was about evaluating how you responded and how you acted under pressure. And you wouldn't want in a process like that for there to be some confusion around, oh, somebody through some lucky stroke or something else ended up with the right answer, but they weren't the best person to respond in those circumstances, right?
Yeah, that's a great observation, that it wasn't about solving the problem. Sometimes you were given instructions. Let's say there was a problem and everyone was given 10 minutes to come up with a plan individually. And then regardless of how good your plan was, no one had seen it at that point, you were all put back in the same group. And they said, okay, you have 10 minutes to now plan as a group and convince the group that your plan is the best plan. But what if your plan isn't the best plan? My plan wasn't. So I don't know if they were looking for you to truly succeed at those instructions. You want to convince everyone to do it your way, even though it might mean that your group does poorly or worse. Or are you going to lay all the cards on the table and say, I know my instructions are to convince you my plan is the best, but I don't feel that it is. We should go with your plan, or we should do some hybrid, or we should solve the problem together. So a lot of situations where maybe I don't even now know exactly what they were looking for, or even what they saw. I don't see their notes. I didn't see I saw the result, but I didn't see how they got there. So, but it must be really fascinating for whoever is developing this process and analyzing the outcome in that. How do people react in that situation? And I think the main stressor, the result of the stressor that you put on people is that anyone can play nice when the conditions are good. But when things don't work and the simulations do feel very real at the time, if you're in, let's say, a gas mask or there's a fire to put out, you do have a reaction. And at that point, you can't play nice, really. Your true colors come out. How do you work with people? How do you solve the problem alone? What kind of person are you? I think that's what their outcome was.
Is there a lesson in that, do you think? Because when I hear you talk about that, it makes me think about how we are often too focused on outcomes and not enough on developing a good process. And that if you can develop a good process, then more times than not, you'll get good outcomes. But we tend to judge things on the outcome rather than the process.
Certainly. So part of when you asked me initially, something that I'd learned recently is that it's not always about solving the problem or about the solution. A lot of times it is about the process, and a lot of the problems that we face in a real life context, whether it's at work or in other situations, they're very complex. They involve a lot of moving parts. A lot of those moving parts are different people and different ways of working. Everyone might have a different goal, and a lot of times you have to get there, or at least get to something which is good enough, and it's not necessarily the perfect solution, but you have to be able to assess what is best. It's not always complete. It doesn't always make everyone happy. Hopefully you have processes along the way that ensure good outcomes, like things like healthy conflict, or hashing it out, or listening to each other, being a team player, following effectively, leading effectively, all of these tools in your kind of toolbox to solve problems, but you won't always get there. And I think in my previous career, I certainly was focused on the outcome, and I was a perfectionist, but you kind of have to solve the problem in parts. Some problems are just too big to solve to come to a complete solution the way that you would like to in other circumstances.
Yeah, doesn't that just describe life in a way, right? That a lot of the problems we encounter in life, it's more about, hey, how can we make this situation better, not how can we resolve it completely and put it to rest entirely, right?
Exactly. And in my job now, I'm faced with many risks, and there's no way to make those risks go away. So how do we mitigate, prepare, prep for the best possible outcome? And a lot of times we might not even stick to the plan when it comes to it, but again, it's the process of planning that's important, not necessarily the plan. And you just want to be as prepared as possible. So this is, yeah, I agree, a great life lesson. Maybe this is just my path to learning it. Maybe everyone has to learn it eventually in their own way.
Let's talk a little bit about risk, because you've taken on a dangerous job, and I'm curious to know what your relationship with risk is like, and how you think about those risks, and what your thought process is about them.
Risk is certainly unavoidable in a lot of situations. It's tied inherently with this job. We have a lot of lessons learned from handling risk and from tragic outcomes in this job. And I think that institutional history is very important, understanding it and talking about it. So it's definitely something that we work to mitigate, and it never really goes away. So for an astronaut, the solution to that is preparation, thinking about all of the different outcomes. We never train for, you've probably heard other astronauts say this, but we never train for a good day in space or an average day in space. And there are lots of those. I mean, people on the International Space Station, one person might live there upward of 200 days to a year. And there are a lot of those days are what we call nominal. They're happy days, you're doing your job, making a scientific contribution to our understanding of the way things work, and nothing challenging or difficult happens beyond just your everyday environment. But by preparing for the worst at every kind of turn or in every scenario, I think that we set ourselves up as well as we can for success. But it certainly is something to get used to in this job. The relationship with risk, it is always there.
There's another lesson, though, right there. I think a lot of people hope for good days and don't prepare for bad days. And I think we'd all be better off if we spent some time, not dwelling on it too much, but acknowledging that there are going to be bad days and we're going to be prepared for them, rather than pretending they're never going to happen and then being surprised and unprepared when they do.
Yeah, that's a nice way to sum it up, really. Prepare for the worst and hope for the best. I guess that's another way of talking about this in kind of a little in a small sort of way, but it is true. I think it does help you to, at least it certainly helps me to walk through all of these different scenarios, and it is a big part of my job. So hopefully by the time that we are encountering these situations, again, the path to flying in space is very, very long. And there's a lot of training involved. So it takes a long time to learn how to react in these scenarios and figure out all the circumstances. But hopefully by the time you get there, you're a pretty well prepared person. And yeah, the training is very rigorous. So we certainly prepare for the worst, hope for the best.
Yeah, and my son plays baseball, and so I talk to him sometimes about how the reason that a professional baseball player who's already been playing baseball his whole life, maybe has been in the major leagues for 7 or 8 years, still goes out every day and fields ground balls and takes tricky hops and handles situations that may never come up in the game that he's about to play. The reason he does that is so that when something unusual happens, it doesn't feel as unusual to him because he's prepared for it. Is that what astronaut training is like, a little bit, or at least a component of it?
Certainly, you have these scenarios and actions, whether they're these bold-face actions that you should be able to do off a memorized response or kind of a rule book you can go to with contingencies in it. But I think probably the biggest thing that we try and do is we try and train that reaction under pressure. And whether you go to your toolbox and use an exact response, that would be great. But you're not going to be concerned about the little things. Those should be trained. So let's say you're on a spacewalk and something goes wrong. Communication. It shouldn't be the priority. We say aviate, navigate, communicate. So these are a list of priorities, of course. First, fly, figure out where you're going, and then you talk to people. But let's say communication, this is a good example. So if something goes wrong, the ground can't see what you see. They can't feel what you feel. They have some insight into telemetry of your spacesuit, but how do you explain what's happening? A great example of this was a couple of years ago on a spacewalk. One of the Italian astronauts we work with, Luca, he was on a spacewalk with Chris Cassidy, who's actually back in space now, and he had some water well up in his suit. That's something the ground didn't have insight into. And it's very dangerous. It was a very dangerous situation. Completely, we hadn't trained for that scenario. We do now, but we hadn't at the time. How do you communicate what's happening so the ground has enough information to find a safe solution? Eventually, his comm did cut out because the water was in his helmet. So what do you do then? All of these different scenarios, you kind of might not have the exact solution in your toolbox. You haven't trained it, but you're familiar enough with what you do in a contingency to know how to get to some sort of solution, a safe solution.
And I'm assuming that one ended well, because I would have heard more about it if it didn't, right?
Absolutely. It was a big success and a testament to the training that we do for spacewalks, which are very risky. So yeah, if anyone's interested in that, I would really recommend looking it up. I think, I don't know the exact year, but it was a couple years ago, and it's part of our kind of core training now. Again, the Italian astronaut was Luca. And you can find a lot of great information and him talking about it afterwards as well, which is really interesting.
So you were chosen as one of Canada's next astronauts, and then you went, as you mentioned, to Houston to do a 2-year training program, and that included a whole range of things from learning Russian to how to fly a jet, and you did survival training and all kinds of things. And there are obviously many things that we could talk about that you learned during that time, but I'm curious to know kind of what you learned beyond the practical aspects of it. What were some of the lessons you gained from the whole experience and from the learning itself?
Well, it was a hugely positive experience. First of all, I think I had a lot of moments where I was like, I really am so fortunate. I can't believe that I have these opportunities to develop this area of expertise that otherwise I just wouldn't have the opportunity to. So there was a lot of wow, this is my job, this is great. And it's hard to say what was not necessarily the most practical, but something that is often glossed over. It's getting I think people are more aware of it now, but the sort of we call them expeditionary skills that you would learn from completing these activities. So again, this was an emphasis in the recruitment process, but how do you work with people in a small crew when things don't go as planned? And I guess risk assessment is involved with that, but also how do you work with others? How do you follow and lead effectively? Those are not necessarily skills that we consider like the hard technical skills you might learn from flying a jet, but they're certainly involved when you're in a crew of 2 in the cockpit and something goes wrong. And they're as large a focus in our training as I think a lot of the technical aspects. Can you be a good crewmate? How do you work in teams to make the job of people around you easier? How do you make them better astronauts rather than just focusing on yourself? And I was really happy to see that emphasis, actually. I really enjoyed that.
And has your perspective changed based on the last 3 years of what you've been through, of the 1-year application process and then the 2 years in Houston?
Yeah, certainly. I'd worked in teams before, and I'd led groups in my lab before and worked with different personalities, but not to the depth or even the depth or the breadth really of what I do in this job. So I've learned a lot about how to be an effective teammate, interact effectively with a number of different people. Yeah, I think that would be a big outcome for me. And then I'm sure that people who have known me through the process can can talk about other little ways that I've changed. But I think that's a big one for me. I've learned a lot about that, and it's been really positive.
Back yourself, as you said earlier. That was one of the big lessons, and I think it's a great message to share with people. Can you talk more about how you learned that and what you mean by it?
Of course. So this idea of backing yourself, we have skill sets and goals, and hopefully our skills that we develop along the way will get us to our goals. But there's so much along the way that we can tell ourselves that either furthers us to the goal or kind of holds us back a little bit. And it's worth being aware of the kind of things you're telling yourself, or whether something as simple as, let's say, an application process, putting yourself forward for something that you might not think is realistic. I just feel that there are so many systems in place that are set up as gates that you might get told no from any number of those gates. People around you might not be supportive. Maybe there's some structural bias that's preventing you from being as successful as someone else. We have a lot of those set up as well. There might be someone on the application board who doesn't see potential. There might be a lot that you just have to work on, which is totally fine, but why should you be the one who says no if there are so many other gates out there to potentially say, no, you need to work on this, or no, let's go in this other direction. You should be the person who's backing yourself. And I think I was very fortunate with mentors in my career who did back me. And you should just believe in yourself a little bit, even though you might need to work on a lot along the way. I mean, that's completely normal, and failures are normal, but you shouldn't be telling yourself no.
So are there specific practices that come into play for that for you? Like, do you check yourself sometimes? Do you remind yourself of that? How does that manifest itself in behavior and actions?
Certainly, I think practice is important. So I guess I started this journey when I was at Cambridge, which is this very old institution that I certainly looked up to. And by the time that I got the academic position, the permanent position there, let alone was there for my PhD, you initially have sort of these feelings that you kind of duped someone to get in there, you're this imposter syndrome. But even if you believe that in your heart, that you in some way navigated your way in and you're not supposed to be there. I mean, this institution had 800 years of experience of picking people who should learn there. So why shouldn't I just trust that as well? I mean, there are lots of little cues you can tell yourself, and eventually you won't really need to tell yourself them as actively anymore. They'll just be there, and it'll be second nature to put yourself forward for these opportunities. So I think practicing early on with really actively making sure you don't have that voice telling you like, I don't deserve this, or that went pretty badly. You get out of that person's head who's the evaluator. You don't know.
You are focused on a very long-term goal. Like, this has been a really long process, and there are not a lot of things in life like that, really, where there are some jobs, I guess, where maybe an architect who's building some massive project, but to a large extent, our jobs and the timelines for things have been increasingly shortened. So what have you learned about being focused on a long-term goal, putting years into what will end up being perhaps a few weeks in space?
It's interesting, those comparisons. I think there is a lot to the job of being an astronaut, which isn't necessarily intuitive for many people. It wasn't intuitive to me before I took this job, that being an astronaut is so much more than flying in space. Really, flying in space is the capstone of your career. So it's this amazing mission that you kind of have the opportunity to be at the front of the spear that we're throwing to try and explore space, but there are so many people on that team, and I think that when you're working toward that, you're learning so much along the way about not only yourself and how you train to fly in space and what kind of procedures you should follow, contingencies, things like that, but you're also part of that team that works to further space exploration generally. So for instance, right now, I'm actually working as, we call it an increment lead, but like a crew rep. Let's say I'm the representative of the crew that's in space right now, because they can't obviously attend these meetings that talk about the priorities of their mission or what science they're going to do up there. So it's my job as a representative for Chris Cassidy, who's in space right now, the commander of the space station. What is the priority for him being in space? What does he want to focus on? What's the goal? And a lot of people with much more experience than me know that and have that set up, but I act as his representative on the ground. So that's a big support role that we fill in the astronaut office for every astronaut that flies in space. Every crew has this support person on the ground. So you do that prior to flying. You test hardware, you develop procedures, you continue your own training. Let's say you get in the suit in the neutral buoyancy lab and you practice a spacewalk to develop a procedure for the person who's going to do it in space in 2 years from now. So it's all this just monumentous effort, this huge team on the ground that you're a part of. And eventually you will be in space, but it's definitely part of the journey to do, I guess, the less glamorous to some, but still important and really interesting jobs on the ground as well. So yeah, I like to think of space as like the capstone, but everything you're doing every day is working toward furthering the mission. It's the mission that's the best thing about this job. It's really cool.
Yeah, and I think of a bunch of birds or geese flying in a V formation, and everybody gets a turn at the front of the V, right? And most people are going to pay attention when you're at the front of the V, but you've done all this work in other parts of the V formation as well, right? Is it a bit like that?
Yeah, I can see that being a good analogy, and a lot of the work that you do to support your crewmates is really enjoyable as well. Like I have really loved the past couple of months of being Chris's crew rep, and Capcom's another great example. You're the capsule communicator and part of this huge ground team that they know everything about the space station, and you're the voice that talks to the crew that's on the International Space Station. Developing new vehicles, developing the hardware interfaces for these new vehicles. Are they intuitive? Can you operate them quickly? Can you operate them easily? What should the training be like? All of these are questions that we answer on the ground before we fly in space.
So you've been preparing to go to space at some point in the future for years now. You've probably learned a lot about what it will be like, but I can't imagine that anything about your preparation will fully create the feeling of what it's going to be like when you actually are in space. Do you think about that? Do you imagine it still? Do you have a picture of it in your mind?
Yeah, it's hard to say what it would actually be like. There are things that are kind of in the back of your mind. You hear your friends talk about what it's like to go to space, like talking to David, who came back last year, the Canadian astronaut. There are all sorts of things that he told me, or other people who have been in the office, but it doesn't really, I think it is unique for everybody because everyone has slightly different priorities, different family situations. So how your family reacts, how you support your family, how are they supported through other channels, that's different for everybody. I've heard some things are pretty universal, like the feeling that you get when you see the Earth for the first time. Like you can just imagine circling our planet and seeing every place you've ever been, like all the experiences of your life you just see on this huge live world map, and that must be pretty powerful. But there are the minutia and the little details of the experience, I imagine, are different for everybody. So I don't know what they'll be like for me.
Well, you will soon find out. When exactly, do you have a timetable right now, by the way, on when you're likely?
No timetable. So it's kind of a guessing game as you get closer to the mission. We don't really know what the mission will be yet. Josh and Jeremy and I all are awaiting our first mission, but we don't have a timeline. There are some exciting things coming up though. So all these new vehicles that are coming online, of course, I'm sure most people are aware, and a lot of people watched the SpaceX Dragon, the Demo 2 mission with Bob and Doug this summer. That was really cool. So that's a new vehicle that's coming up. Boeing's vehicle, Orion, the NASA vehicle that's coming up, all sorts of cool opportunities, and then cool missions, maybe even lunar missions coming up. So we'll just have to see. A lot is changing pretty quickly, but we don't know what it would be yet or when.
Okay. Well, living with uncertainty is part of the job, I guess, and adapting to that. So, Jenni, this has been so interesting and so powerful. There's so many great lessons, especially for girls like my daughter who is into math, and I want to sustain and support that as much as possible. Thank you so much for your time today. This has really been great.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much. It was a joy to talk to you, and hopefully we can do it again in the future. I had a great time.
I've been sharing some of Jenni's lessons with a number of different people since we spoke, especially that powerful lesson about backing yourself. I think that's so important. I really enjoyed hearing her describe as well all the difficult tasks and challenges that she overcame during the astronaut selection process and her space training, including when she didn't even know what they were evaluating her on. And she still succeeded and was able to move it forward. A huge thank you again to Jenni Sidey-Gibbons for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode of Digging Deep, then please review it and share it with others. That will help us produce more great content. And if you want to keep digging deep into topics and lessons like this, then you have some options. Please subscribe to our weekly newsletter or read my blog at letsdigdeep.com. That's letsdigdeep.com. Thank you for listening.